We have with us today Kathryn Huwig. Welcome, and proceed whenever you're ready.
Chairman Wiggum, Vice Chairman John, Ranking Member Kelly, and honorable members of the State and Local Government Reform Committee. My name is Kathryn Huwig, and I thank you for the opportunity to again address this committee on the topic of Governor DeWine's response to the COVID-19 epidemic. I was last in front of this committee just 2 weeks ago, at which time I listed a number of significant abnormalities in Ohio's publicly available COVID-19 data. Specifically, I pointed out that the presence of errors such as post-mortem infections, as well as hospitalizations and deaths with data that was incongruent with the course of an acute respiratory infection. Specifically, as of the February 21st data, 44.1% of hospitalizations had anomalous data, with a staggering 75.7% of deaths associated with clear oddities. I stand here today to report that ODH seems to have heard me. After months of leaving the incorrect data untouched, within a few days of my testimony, 11 out of the 16 post-mortem infections had been corrected. But as of March 2nd, 5 of them still remained. The next day, ODH fully solved the post-mortem infection problem, as well as every question I had raised about the oddities surrounding our death numbers. How, you may ask? They did it by simply removing all of that information. When they changed their method of counting deaths, they also disconnected all onset date and admission date information from those deaths. Now, all we receive is a list of demographics and onset date with admission dates, if applicable, and a separate listing of demographic information with only the date of death. Now, no one can go into the data and ask the questions I dared to pose in my testimony 2 weeks ago. The data is simply gone. Problem solved. But as I am a curious and tenacious person, I can show that in all likelihood those 5 remaining post-mortem infections are still being counted. In my written testimony, I have a spreadsheet showing where 4 of the remaining post-mortem infections were listed on March 2nd and on March 3rd. The 5th post-mortem infection is not listed because how its data was changed is hard to fully track. I would like to specifically draw your attention to the case of the Warren County child of unknown sex. This child in the March 2nd CSV file was listed as having died on January 30th, 2021, and had an onset date 1 day later on January 31st. On March 3rd CSV file, the death data and onset data had been split, but there remained a 0 to 19-year-old individual of unknown sex from Warren County with an onset date of January 31st. Is this the same individual? We have no way of knowing for sure, but it seems highly likely. The same thing happened to the other post-mortem infections from Warren and Franklin counties. The date of death was stripped away, and just one more case was added to that demographic's onset date. No more questionable data discrepancies to see here. So to make this clear, when I came to you 2 weeks ago to talk about specific instances where I could say these deaths are associated with specific problems, they need to be investigated, I can no longer do that. I can't even have that level of oversight because they stripped the data away. It's just gone. The second issue I would like to bring up today is a direct question to Dr. Thomas, Dr. Vanderhoff, and Governor DeWine's other unnamed epidemiologists and other medical professionals. We are told day after day for a year now how we are following the science when it comes to mandates and restrictions, and that the only thing protecting us from COVID-19 are all of these destructive restrictions and the power of the mask. I would like you to examine, this is also in my written testimony, this graph showing ICU bed occupancy in Ohio over the course of this pandemic. This graph is taken from the Ohio Hospital Association, which feeds the data into our coronavirus.ohio.gov dashboard. This is our hospitalization data. It's direct census of the day. And it shows April 10th until March 8th, 2021. I have deliberately left off the x-axis, which shows time. And I invite the experts advising the governor to please locate when mandates went into effect or were lifted. Where was it that businesses were first allowed to open in the spring? Where on this graph did the George Floyd protests occur? Where were the mask mandates implemented? When was the curfew put into place? When was it removed? Where is Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's? All of these events, we are told, had large effects on the activity of the virus in Ohio. If that is true, then it should be simple to identify all of those events on this graph. But it's clearly not so simple to do. Instead of being able to quickly and easily identify those supposedly powerful events, what we see is a very classic epidemiological curve demonstrating Farr's law. Farr's law is a 180-year-old observation that epidemics rise and fall following a predictable, roughly bell-shaped curve. Our actions have amounted to little to nothing over the past year. Epidemics are still a force of nature, and it would be wise to remember that. In conclusion, I would like to quote the brilliant physicist Richard Feynman on how to judge the value of scientific theory. He said, "It doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, or how smart you are, or what your name is. If it disagrees with experience, it's wrong. That's all there is to it." This is why I support the passage of SB22 and urge the addition of an emergency clause. Governor DeWine and ODH have shown that they are not interested in fixing errors or showing or explaining the exact evidence used to support the edicts they have made. Instead, all questions are brushed aside and contradictory evidence is erased. Without an emergency clause, the people of Ohio will remain under these unscientific mandates for much too long, inflicting even more irreversible harm on citizens and businesses. Thank you. I can take questions.
Thank you for your testimony. And do we have questions from the committee today? Representative Grindell.
Through the chair, Ms. Huwig, I'm so thankful you came back again. I know it's very hard and it's cumbersome, but you really care about these issues. Now, you mentioned that you had when you testified last time, you had several dates, cases, where you saw that they were impossible to be COVID, if I say that, and the dates were after the person died, and now they're gone.
I cannot check that anymore.
They're gone from the database that public could use.
Yes, so the way the database is set up is that there are a certain number of columns. So originally they're all there still, but there's county, sex, age range, date of onset, date of admission, if applicable, and date of death, if applicable, as well as case counts, hospitalization counts, and death counts. So that's the data that is there in the CSV file. And previously, every single one of those columns would be populated. So you would see, an onset date of March 27th, person was never hospitalized, so an empty thing there, and died, November of 2020. So you would see that connected together. What has happened now, ever since they changed the way they count deaths, is they still have those three columns, but the deaths are listed alone. So there's no more onset date and hospitalization date associated with a death. The onset date and hospitalization date associated with those deaths, presumably, we have no way of knowing again, is completely separate. Does that make sense? So now we have data that has two columns filled, but not death. And then we have a second set of data where there are two columns empty, but only death dates. So those are no longer comparable to each other.
Follow-up.
Mr. Chair, follow-up. What do you believe is the effect of this? What's the effect to all of us when you can't see when they went to the hospital or the onset, or is that a corruption of numbers?
Well, there's no way to check it. I mean, I've been looking at this data now for many months, and I could look at it and I could actually see over time there are certain time periods through this epidemic where the data got worse, and I could see it happening in real time. I can't even see that now. I cannot look into the data to see if they've been fixing it. That information is gone. I cannot, even in my position, staring at this for so long, I can no longer tell you, are we still at 75.7% of deaths are odd? Or has it dropped to 60%? Or have they cleaned it up entirely? I cannot make any judgments on that. So how can we understand if the data that we are basing all of our actions on is you know, you cannot examine it. You cannot critically evaluate it and say, this is nonsense, or yeah, that does seem pretty reasonable. I mean, if 75% of our deaths are not due to COVID, would we still be talking about this? Would we? Probably not.
Thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony today.